Hey, Pastor Billy here, and we'll be posting another video shortly giving you some more details on our continued response to the situation. I wanted to share with you just a few verses before I did that that have been on my heart. This comes from Psalm 78, verses 21 to 24, and just a few thoughts on the background. So this is the days of Moses. A long time ago, a very tumultuous time in the history of God's people. Remember that they were previously enslaved in Egypt, and God raised up Moses, their deliverer, who brought them out of Egypt, brought them through the Red Sea, and they ended up in the desert. And times got tough in the desert. Food began to run out. Water began to run out. And if you're familiar with the story, you know what happened next. God's people began to complain. They began to grumble, and this feels like a very, appears to me to be a very natural and very normal thing to do. They're in the desert. Things are tough. It's uncertain what the future will look like. Food is running out. Water is running out. And Psalm 78, verses 21 to 24, gives us God's perspective of what's going on there. Verse 21 says this: "Therefore, when the Lord heard their grumbling, he was full of wrath. A fire was kindled against Jacob. His anger rose against Israel." And the next verse tells us why. Because they did not believe in God. And they did not trust in his saving power. Right there's the heart of the issue. This isn't just about complaining and grumbling. It was a failure of God's people to look to God. It was a failure of them to trust in his saving power. One of the things we might say is, in the midst of that, in the midst of them in the desert, they were walking in fear, not walking in faith. And this was serious stuff for God. But what comes next is truly remarkable. Verse 23 says this: "Yet he," right, God, "commanded the skies above, and he opened the doors of heaven, and he rained down on them manna to eat, and he gave them the grain of heaven." Right? Do you get that? Right? In the midst of God's people being faithless, in the midst of God's people complaining and grumbling and failing to look to God and failing to trust in his saving power, yet he was still gracious. That should be a tremendous encouragement. It's a tremendous encouragement to be, because I often find myself, more often than I'd like to admit, acting like God's people in the desert, and yet God is still gracious to us. He's still gracious to his people. He calls down this miraculous bread called manna for them to eat. And even that manna provides an interesting insight into how God's grace works, because remember, God's people had to go out each day and find that manna. The temptation was to go out and to grab what you need and grab what you and your family would need for the week or for the month. But God wouldn't allow that. If they gathered more than what they would need for that day, it would rot in their presence. And the principle is this: that God provides us with the grace that we need in our moment of need. We can't get ahead of ourselves. In the midst of this ongoing situation, I realize some of you listening have been already affected more deeply than others, and I want you to know that God is still seated on the throne, that he still continues to be gracious to us, even when we're grumbling, even when we're moving in fear. But let's look to him, church. Let's continue to look to him. Let's continue to walk in faith, to move by faith and not by fear. Again, we'll be posting another video shortly, giving you some more details on what we're doing here as a church. I encourage you to stay tuned for that. And remember, live stream Sunday morning. No church in person, but we will be live streaming again, and that's Sunday 10 a.m.